Well, hello everyone, and welcome to the Leader's Inner Journey, where we explore the keys to leadership effectiveness from the inside out. And my guest today is Patty Sobczak, and I'd like to share a little bit about her. Patty has her PhD in Human and Organizational Systems and her master's in Library Information Science. She's a teacher, educator, librarian, consultant, and creator. She has over 25 years of experience in higher education in a variety of leadership roles. She's the co-owner of Sabo Associates. Did I say that right?
Yes, you did.
Great. A consulting firm specializing in leadership development for individuals and organizations. She also owns Celebrate Now, a company specializing in creating unique decorator pieces using rescued, recycled, and upcycled items in new and creative ways. Patty, thank you so much for joining us today. I really appreciate it.
Oh, thank you for having me. It's always fun to talk about leadership.
I know it is. And so we're going to take a little bit of a different angle than most people. Most people kind of look at leadership from the outside. We're going to start with kind of an exercise that I like to use with everybody. And that is from your own experience, in your own opinion, if you can kind of in your mind compare leaders that you've had tons of respect for and compare those with leaders that have just, been maybe average or even below average, what would you say are maybe some of the major differences?
Well, I'll give a disclaimer to start with, and that is that the terms great and average are very relative.
Mm-hmm.
But here's some things to think about when you think about average or very, very good or great leaders. And that one thing I've noticed is that average leaders might exhibit some really good leadership traits and characteristics, but the difference between an average leader and a great leader is really the great leader has the ability to impact their people and environment in really substantial ways, including their ability to drive change, transform their organization and their people, create synergy, inspire others to become better, and also to achieve organizational goals in new and creative ways. If you think about patterns of great leaders, what that looks like, I really think that most great leaders seem to have this wonderful, rare combination of several things. And this may be different for each person, but for me personally, I look at drive, empathy, integrity, humility, and confidence. I also, some of the greatest leaders I've known have this amazing ability to have productive and honest, crucial conversations. And they do this on an ongoing basis so that issues get resolved instead of festering. I also think that they are very outward focused and towards their people and organization, and they very rarely get caught up in their own drama or pettiness.
Yeah, what I was most struck with, um, based on what you said, is this ability to just really make a huge impact. And and I think about that. And then you also added some characteristics like empathy and humility. And you also added this ability to constantly lean into those crucial conversations. So when I think about what you said and I sort of summarize it, I would say those are the things that jumped out at me. And
Mhm.
when you think about those things, I mean, everybody wants to be that, right? So I'm watching this video, or listening to the podcast, and I'm thinking, all right, yeah, but I want to be that kind of leader. I want to make major impact. I think everyone in a leadership position wants to have major impact. What do you imagine is the difference on the inside between the leaders that are able to make this major impact, who have these characteristics, who continuously lean into these conversations? What do you think is different on the inside between these leaders and maybe, let's say, our normal everyday person?
Well, I think one thing I've noticed, and I think Max Dupree talked about this, is that great leaders seem to be very grounded in reality.
Hmm.
They know who they are, they know how they show up every day. And while all people have inner demons, I would say great leaders have learned how to manage their demons in really productive ways. I also think that most great leaders have a sense of optimism and quiet power. And that helps keep them focused and very, very grounded. And for me, what I've learned about great leaders and what I've seen is that for great leaders, it's not about them. It's really about their people and their organization. So there's this very strong, constant outward mindset that they seem to have.
Yeah, I love that. And so, how do you think they get that way? And when I talk about the leader's inner journey, I think that's the journey that I'm talking about. So, you
Hmm.
know, I'm wanting to be a great leader, and I'm in an organization, and maybe I have a management position, but I'm listening to this, and I want to have that great impact. And so now I'm hearing, okay, so in order to have that great impact, I really need to be grounded in reality. Um, and I need to make it not about myself. How do I get there on the inside? Like, in your opinion, what would you say is the journey to becoming that way?
Well, it's different, as I say. I always say it's a relative term, and it's different for every person. But from my experience, I think that great leaders are just really passionate about learning and growing
Hmm.
themselves and others. They recognize the need to take calculated risks, both personally and professionally, in order to learn the things that they need. They're willing, like you said, to kind of lean into difficult situations. Something else I've noticed is that they are willing to admit their shortcomings, their faults, and also their mistakes, but they're not derailed by any of these. And also something that's I've found through the years that and as I have grown as a leader is not being afraid to ask for help or seeking counsel. Because being a great leader is the ability to know what you don't know and then find the answers to those things through a lot of different ways by asking other people, self growth activities, reading, attending seminars and programs. And it's really about this openness to new ideas, but always knowing who you are and being very grounded in yourself and what really matters to you, not ever letting that go.
Yeah, so I'm listening to what you're saying, and it sounds like that takes a lot of time, right? And so I think about if I were in a position now where I wanted to start that journey, I might join some kind of self growth program. I might start reading all these leadership books and self help books. I might ask people for feedback, see what my organization has to offer in terms of professional growth. But it
Mhm.
sounds like it's work, right? It's sort of, it isn't an easy thing to do, but if you're committed to it, which is what I hear you saying, if you're constantly committed to it, then you do change over time.
Yeah, I think it also, I'd say it's a lot of work, but it's incredibly scary because if you are open to learning and growing, then you may have to let go of some things or traits or things you've done for years that you thought were really effective, and you find out that they're not. And that's a really scary thing. And it's a scary thing to say, I don't know, in front of people that are looking up to you, or to admit you made a mistake. Those are so that it's not only just the work, it's the capacity to really be vulnerable and to face your own fears. And that's where a lot of people do get derailed. They can read and go to seminars and talk to people, but that really tough work of really facing your own, who you are and what you do and if it's effective or not, or getting like results from a 360 that really surprise you and you go, ooh, I don't know, I didn't know I approached people like that. And being able to not just fall apart from that, but be able to say, wow, that's really interesting. I need to know more about that, and be willing to take that deep dive. So it's complex, it's scary, it's not easy. And so it's a road that a lot of people end up not choosing to go down because there's just many elements of really bad things that can happen along the way.
I am getting intrigued, and I'd like to hear some examples. So, if you'd like to share some examples from your own professional journey, but I know that you've also managed leaders, and I would just love to hear. I'm thinking about one example myself of someone who recently shared her journey where she always felt that being the manager or being the leader, she needed to have the answer. So anytime anybody came up to her and asked her a question, if she wasn't entirely clear on the answer, she would get really embarrassed and awkward and kind of try to make up an answer. And what she didn't realize is the power of kind of not knowing the answer and how positive that could be. And she shared a little bit about how she made that shift internally, sort of mentally. Do any examples come up from you, either from your own journey or from situations that you've observed and people that you've supervised?
Well, when I thought about talking to you today, I thought about how much I've actually grown as a leader. And from one of my first leadership positions, I was the campus director at Chapman University for an offsite campus. And I had to apply for the job. I had to compete for it, and I won the position. And I really, really wanted it because I wanted to have more impact on change and make the center really successful. It really had been struggling. So I felt like I had kind of walked in the door with a lot that I already knew. I had read a lot about leadership. I'd actually been teaching leadership for a few years. And I had spent some time on self-growth and gaining knowledge and stuff. So I really felt I had some good instincts that I could kind of start with. And I knew what I wanted to do. I was very clear that I wanted to create an organization that was really fair and just, and also encouraged honest conversation. One example I had to my folks, I said, I used to say that I would listen to anyone's story, idea, complaint, or argument, but that didn't mean that I would necessarily change my mind, but I would always listen. And I
Mm-hmm.
thought that was really important. And people exercise that all the time, but I love that. I loved feeling like they could be honest with me. And I got a lot of really good feedback for how I did that. But what I didn't realize was a really important part that I was missing. And that was that there were 20 other people who were running campuses for Chapman all over the country. And that actually did essentially the same job as me. The campuses were obviously, locally based. And so they had different programs and different, goals and things like that. But it was essentially the same job.
Mm-hmm.
But I was not, at that time in my leadership journey, I was not willing or able or comfortable asking them for advice or counsel. So I
Mm-hmm.
felt like I had to go it alone. And I just have to say out loud, I was really wrong in that assumption. And so today, as I take on leadership roles, I realize how important it is to work with other people, to ask them, people that you value, not everyone, of course, not everyone in the world, but people that might have some insight or do the same job as me or have done the same job. And I think if I would have done that back then and
Mm-hmm.
really leveraged my relationships with the other directors, I think I would have been actually a much more effective leader. I think I would have made fewer mistakes. I think I just would have been just more effective. Part of that is just my nature is that it's hard for me to be vulnerable and admit that I need help. And that was really tough for me. But now I think I would have been so much more effective if I had used their help and asked for their support. So big lesson learned, but I learned it and I operate very differently now.
It's interesting how much of taking yourself to the next level of leadership involves sort of battling with part of your internal ego, right? So when I listen to this story and I think about myself as a coach and how a lot of times I want to just go it alone. And I think my models and everything that I do is great. And then sometimes I'll come across another coach that's just done something brilliant. And I find now that when I embrace that, it often adds to what I can do with my clients. And so this isolationist thing, but there's also a little jealousy sometimes,
Yeah.
right? It's like, oh, they're
Hmm.
doing a great job. And if I don't know and I reach out to them, or if I, talk them up or whatever it is, then does that make me less? So there's this kind of this idea that we all have, and I don't know how many of us have it, but I know that, kind of in my own career, I've had this
Hmm.
idea that there's a lot of value in being the best, right? So I'm
Hmm.
sort of gunning to have enough achievements so that I can be seen as maybe the best in my field. And a lot of times that produces a blind spot, right?
Mm-hmm.
If we feel like we have to be the best, then we can't really value the contributions of others. So I love that example. And, just hearing you say it brought up so many connections for me in my own leadership journey.
And for me, even being able to share that story is really a big deal for me. So
Mm-hmm.
I can see how much I've grown by being able to say, hey, I could have done better. And now what am I doing about it? I'm doing better. I'm managing better. I'm leading better. What I do as a leader is so much more effective than it was. And that's just great evidence. But it was scary. It was scary to think about. So yeah.
Yeah, and I love that you bring up, it's scary, right? Because the
Hmm.
internal experience, and I'll just kind of go back to the example that I just gave for myself as a coach. I remember joking with another coach, but it was such a relief to do it. I remember actually being able to call out my own pettiness and say, well, I'm really jealous that this other coach did this, but it's
Hmm.
really, really good stuff. So I'm going to support this coach and then since then I've incorporated a lot of that work into my own work. But it was fun because I had another coach that I was working with at the time, and she was even further along in her journey than I have been. And and then because I set the stage by naming jealousy, she was able to also name her own jealousy, and we were able to kind of joke about it. But then that also made it dissipate. And I know I mean, it may seem really trite, but being able to confront some of the petty things in yourself or the demons. I think
Hmm.
when I think about you talking about scary, I think, that's a lot of what it is.
Hmm.
I think the great leaders, as you said, they've confronted their demons. But when we ask, well, what is it to confront a demon? It really does put you in a physical place of having to deal with the meaning you've assigned to
Hmm.
other people achieving things maybe that you haven't, or to having flaws that everyone else can see and maybe you've been blind to.
Hmm. Yeah, very interesting.
So I'm reading a book right now, and I can't off the top of my head remember the author's name, but I do remember the title. It's called The Last Word on Power. And I have a book club tonight. I'm not all the way through it, but I think it applies here because she talks about a winning strategy and how all of us as leaders have a winning strategy. But our winning strategy also produces our blind spot. So it produces a lot of success up to a point, but it
Hmm.
produces our blind spot because whatever doesn't fit with our strategy, or in any situation where behaving in our like winning strategy way isn't effective, we become less effective. And I just think that is really, really, really interesting.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a lot of interesting things we could talk about on power. We're not going to get to that today, but that's such a leadership is a really loaded word, and so is power. And people have almost visceral reactions to it. So actually I want to my next one of the things I want to do at some point is write a book on power. So I want to
Well,
politics and power.
tell a little bit. Do tell a little bit, whatever you're comfortable telling, because I think we have
Well,
time, and I'm very curious about power.
Well, I'm really interested in politics, not to argue about politics, but to actually really research and investigate them.
Hmm.
But I'm really interested to see there's of course, I think things have actually shifted a little bit since I came up with this idea. So I may have to change it a little bit. But this idea of, business versus politics. So, someone in politics is supposedly they're not there for the money, they're there to serve, and be a servant leader or whatever you want to call it. And people who are in business are just trying to make money. There's this, really strong divide that I, again, think isn't as clear anymore. I think it's
Hmm.
kind of interesting. I think, they've kind of melded together more than I think we ever even really realized.
Yeah.
But I would love to investigate. So is someone in politics a better person because they chose, being in power that way, or is profit, making money and being profitable, is that which is better, which is more effective, which is really helping, advance our civilization, our country. And so I just would love to explore that. So looking at the, people that are very political and the people that are very business-like, and see what the differences or similarities are. And I'm not really sure what case I'm trying to make, but that's what good research is. You should never know the outcome before you start investigating. You should
Hmm.
let the information flow, and come to the conclusion that the research supports. So I don't know the answer to that, but that's something I want to pursue and see if there's really something interesting to talk about. There may
You
not
know,
be.
that is so interesting though, because I have heard stories, and I would say both political and corporate. And I don't know what would be supported by your research and what not, because this is just kind of my experience. But I have seen people and stories about people, both in leadership, in political situations, and in business situations, where they sort of started out with the best intentions.
Hmm.
But then at some point, as they're quote unquote climbing up the ladder, they're confronted with things that either produce more power for them or take power away from them.
Hmm.
And I've heard over and over how that can just really be seductive and pull at people's sense of self. And I can only imagine. I mean, I run my own business, so I don't have a lot of political situations, even corporate politics to deal with, but I can only imagine that, like, because to a certain extent, you talk about power being a charged word.
Hmm.
I wonder about that because we want to be empowered, right?
Hmm.
And often, the more power you have, the more impact you can have, right?
Hmm.
But at the same time, there's a lot of people who see power as evil, right?
Hmm.
Because
Hmm.
the more power you have over people, and then maybe the less you have compassion for, or the less you think about the people who don't have power. So I don't know if
Yeah.
those ideas have anything to do with what intrigues you, but
Yeah, I think those are all part of it. I think this idea, I mean, we can go all the way back to Animal Farm, where, I forget the quote exactly, but, power is equal, but some, the pigs, all pigs are equal, but some pigs are more equal than other pigs. And this idea that, they're trying to say we're going to run this very equal society, but then there are people, the pigs move into the house and start dressing like people, and putting power over the other animal. It's just such an interesting story that was written a long, long time ago, but pieces of it are still very relevant. And I think about that, and I think you're right. I think as people advance and get more power, I think it gets very tricky, and it's really, really hard not to be seduced by the power. And I also think power brings money and choices, and access to things that you wouldn't normally have access to. And I think it's very, very alluring, and I think it can change people. And I think that's what I really want to think about and investigate, is how does power change people, and to what end, and what does that look like, and what is the result. So, and again, I have no idea. I think I have some ideas, but I could be totally wrong. And that's what research does for you. Helps
it
you figure out
does.
if you have a good idea or not.
Yeah. So this isn't kind of an off the cuff question, but it relates to what we're talking about. And it's kind of going to transition us to sort of our last question here. But let's say that I'm sort of a new person coming into an organization, and I desperately want to be in a leadership position. And part of my motivation is because I think you know, for me, being a leader sounds like a little bit of prestige, right?
Hmm.
So, so I have to admit that. I'm willing to admit that, and I also willing to admit that I kind of want the money
Hmm.
and the nice houses and all those signs of social status. But I also want to be a good leader. I want to be
Hmm.
a good leader, and I want to do that growing. I want to become somebody that has a lot of impact. So I want to do that growth stuff that you talked about. And I want to be very careful as I'm going through this process not to um, get caught up. Is there any advice that you would give me?
Well, I think, part of it is maybe finding a couple of people that you trust that can be kind of your, kind of mirror you and say, this is what I see. People that, and I always would say out of the organization, people that maybe have similar positions or the positions you want to have, but because taking them out of your environment gives them the objectivity to call you out and say, yeah, you want to do this, but you're awful petty, or you're awful worried about the power and not about the people, or you have such an inward mindset, or you need people that you need to seek counsel from people you trust. And so I think having at least a couple people that are not in your organization that you can turn to for real honest advice, I think is really, really helpful. I've had that through the years. I think that's been very, very instrumental in helping me grow. But if you do that, you've got to be able to take in and lean into when they say, hey, you got to work on this. And that's hard to hear. But it's also probably very honest and people that really care about you. So I think that part is really important. I think being educated, I think, really, if you want to be a good leader, you really have to understand what you're doing. I think also good leaders know their people. And so a lot of leadership to me is very time consuming because there's two aspects that are incredibly time consuming. One of them is getting to know your people, interacting with them on an ongoing basis. You don't want them to see you only when there's a problem. You want them to see you all the time. So that's one thing, but also this communication piece is, we have all this electronic communication. We can send emails and texts and everything, but that takes a lot of time to continually communicate with your people so they're aware of what's going on, how it impacts them, giving them a channel to question or, to say, hey, I don't understand. But communication takes a lot of time. And I probably spent 25% of my time as a leader communicating with people, just making sure that I was being very prudent about sharing what was going on. The thing, you can't share everything, of course, but being able to tease out the things that people could hear and know about, and then creating that two-way communication. So it wasn't just me sending out an email or something or having a meeting. It was that opportunity for them to ask me questions. Hey, I don't understand this, or that doesn't make any sense, or why are we doing this kind of thing? And that takes a lot of time. So if you want to be a leader, that's the prestige is great, the money may be great, but just be aware that to be really effective, you've got to spend a lot of time on the people side, getting to know your people, and then also communicating with them on a very current, ongoing basis. And those two things take up so much time. So you may, that 9 to 5 job you think you're going to have, mean. You can, even if you're working at home, you may be working into the night trying to communicate with people and keeping them up to date and everything. And then you've got to save time for yourself. You've got to save time to grow and kind of, be, rest and kind of recharge your batteries and stuff. So there's a lot of elements to that. And if you're really talking about being effective, if you just want to lead and be power hungry, that's really easy just to, but to be effective, a lot of time and energy and yeah, and you got to be really vulnerable. And that's, again, very scary for a lot of people.
I
So,
love that. So, some of the main things I'm hearing from what you're saying is that if I want to do this, but I want to be great at leadership, then a couple of things I have to do is take the work of leadership seriously.
mhm,
And the work of leadership, a huge part of that is really investing in getting to know my team and my people,
mhm,
and being willing to spend a large percentage of my time communicating with the people on my team. Like, that is my main job. And I,
mhm.
when I coach people, I always talk about how your communication with the people in the team is more of your job than your tasks, which it's hard for high achievers to get out of because they like having that kick of getting something done. But getting your
Yeah.
task done becomes way less important than those relationships. So that's one thing. But then the other thing I want to make sure that we don't lose sight of is what you said in the beginning, which is make sure that you build relationships with people you trust who are maybe peers, or
Mhm,
they could be even higher than you in the organization, but you have a trusting enough relationship so that they're willing to give you good feedback
Mm-hmm.
and you're willing to take it. And that reminds me of mastermind groups because a lot of people will form little mastermind, very unofficial mastermind groups where they get together and you can do this on Zoom. I have a group that I've been working with on a program, and then we continued to work together, starting from working on this program, but we're just continuing to meet. But now other things are coming into play that have nothing to do with the program we started, and I can see how we're just a very powerful cohort where we're really,
Mm-hmm.
really supporting each other in ways that are going to make all of us better. But
Mm-hmm.
you have to have high trust with these people because you have to be willing to, as you said, be vulnerable and share what you're struggling with and trust that they're not going to think less of you because of that.
Yeah, a lot of vulnerability there, but really impactful. And again, that idea of trust and someone who's willing to just tell you how it is, so important. You're the people that work for you probably aren't going to be willing to do that because they're not going to want
Mhm.
to
Of
deal
course.
with the consequences of that. But someone who you that's a peer or someone even a level above you that is objective can do that for you very effectively.
Yeah, and I think that point bears repeating. The people who work for you, even if you have an open door policy, they will never give you real feedback because you're in a
No.
power position to them. So
Yep.
if you're
Yep.
going to get the feedback, you've got to be really, you got to put yourself in a situation where you're going to get it. I love that. So we have one final question, and I like to kind of wrap these up with something very tangible that
Mhm.
people can take away who are trying to grow in their leadership. And so, for our audience that are maybe looking for some tips, can you maybe share one or two effectiveness tips? And it doesn't have to be just about leadership; it can be about you and your work. But what are things that you've learned to do in your work that you believe are key to your own effectiveness?
Well, I think one thing that I want to repeat is this idea of asking for help and counsel. I think it's finding the right people. Again, I wouldn't tell you to talk to everybody because not everyone can be trusted. I mean, that's just the way it is. But maybe a couple people that you really, really feel like can care about you and are there to help you and are willing to be honest with you is so important. So it's being finding those key people. And the other thing too is this idea that I think, and I suffer from it. I'm getting better at it, but is this idea that you want everyone to like you.
Yeah,
You want you want to be
too.
it's a popularity contest. Oh, I'm right there with you. And that the big realization for effective leadership is just recognizing that not everyone's going to like me or my style or my approach, and just having to lean in and live with that information. I
Mhm.
can tell you, I've spent in my career a lot of time trying to win over that one employee or that one student out of dozens and dozens who was unhappy with me. And what I learned is that, having someone unhappy with you is probably pretty normal. You're not going to please everyone. I mean, you're just not. And that all you can do in those situations, if you become aware of someone who's not happy with you, is to really look inward to say,
Mhm.
okay, you know, are my fingerprints on this in some way? So
Mhm.
this idea of looking inward, and asking yourself, have you done your best under these circumstances? Is there anything you would have done differently to, work with this person, and find the lesson in the situation? And then you got to let it go, because if
Mhm.
you hang on to that, it's going to impact everything you do, and that's not going to make you more effective. So, tips of just being able to let go of that stress and distress is key to moving forward and being your best self, and being most effective leader.
Yeah, it's definitely a journey. Well, gosh, Patty, I've so enjoyed having you as a guest, and I just want to thank you for sharing your wisdom and your time with me and with our audience. And for those of you in the audience, thanks for being with us today. And take some of these tips, and best of luck to you on your leadership journey.
Thank you so much. And thanks for chatting with me today. It was really fun. I really enjoyed it.
Excellent. Oh, and before we leave, let's say people want to get in touch with you or maybe ask you more questions or take a look at your business.
Yeah.
What would work for you?
Well, I think I have a personal email, which
Mhm.
is just P for Patty and D for my middle name. So PD and then my last name, Sobczak. Not easy, but Sobczak 13@gmail.com. I'm fine. Drop me an email that we can chat. And if you want to look at my business, it's just www.celebratenow.net, and you can see all the things that I've made from rescued items. So those are two ways to get in touch with me, and I really welcome chances to talk with people. I always learn something. I tell my students this whenever I teach a class. I go, if I told you how much I learned from you, they probably wouldn't pay me to teach the class, because I always walk away with so much more insight when I leave the class than when I first started. So being open and being willing to learn, lots of opportunities out there.
Yeah, so take advantage of that and network with Patty. And for those of you watching the video, I'm hoping that I will edit it. I will actually put these things in writing, but I'm glad you spelled it out for people who are listening to the podcast. Okay, well, thanks again for being with us today. I really appreciate it. And thanks for all of you for listening.